Welcome to this Vodcast about descriptive writing. Today I'm going to try and talk you through some useful strategies that you can use to improve your descriptive writing. Firstly, it's really important to remember that this is not a story. A story will focus on action, whereas we need to focus on description. Remember that in all of your writing you need to show the reader details rather than telling them what they are. So that's very easy for me to say and not so easy to do. What's the best way to get started? The most useful way to start is by using DVDs. This is useful as a mnemonic because it stands for devices, vocabulary, design, and senses. Let's start with devices. What is a device? The easiest way to remember this is to think that devices are comparisons. By comparing one thing to another, you combine the qualities of each, and therefore, whatever it is that you're describing becomes easier to understand. In literary terms, the most common devices are similes, which use like or as in their comparison, metaphors, where you say that one thing is so much like another that it is the same thing, and personification, where you compare something to a human. Remember that when writers use these in their writing, it's to achieve an effect. So therefore, when you craft your writing, you need to use it for the same purpose. The next thing to remember is that you need to use interesting vocabulary. Obviously, all the vocabulary that you use will be important, but here it's useful to think about things like adjectives, which describe nouns, adverbs, which describe verbs, and indeed verbs themselves. It's more interesting to use strong verbs than it is to use weak ones. So if you were going to say, I walked down the street, you could say, I sprinted, or I ran down the street. It will be more effective for the reader. Design is where you put your whole piece of writing together. Design includes a variety of things. We might think sentence starters. Many people start off sentences with nouns, and in many ways there's nothing wrong with that. But if you do it for every single sentence, it becomes really boring to read. So, as well as nouns, you can use verbs. Running down the street I saw. You can use adjectives. Tall and strong, the tree stood over me. You could use an adverb. Slowly I thought to myself. You could start halfway through a simile, like rain from heaven, the feathers flew down. You could, similarly, start halfway through a metaphor. Brave as lions, the soldiers waited for battle. The reason for varying your sentence starters is to avoid making your writing sound like a children's book. All children's stories will have the same types of sentence starters and very similar sentence structure, which leads neatly on to the next element of design, which is sentence structure. If you were to only ever use simple sentences, your writing would be very boring. So therefore, it's important to try and use complex sentences as well. Complex sentences, as we know, have extra clauses to add extra information. Don't forget that you need commas around your clauses. As well as sentence structure, we can think about paragraph structure. It's really tempting to think of paragraphs as a certain length. We tend to think of a paragraph as a big chunk of writing, but actually, sometimes one word or one sentence paragraphs can actually be really effective. The reason for changing to a new paragraph might be to show a change in idea, a change in place, a change in time, but it can also just be to make a certain bit of your writing stand out as something really important. So finally, we need to think about senses. So the senses are fairly obvious. We're thinking the five senses. So we're thinking taste, touch, sight, smell, and sound. Why actually would you need to bother with this type of thing? Really, using the senses as the basis for your writing helps to show the reader. You could just tell them that there's a tree, but if you show them the tree by describing what the bark feels like, the sound of the leaves, the smell of the earth underneath the roots, whatever it might be, that's going to be more effective to the reader. Using the senses is also a useful starting point when you think about your planning. In many ways, if you have a stimulus idea in your mind, you can use the 5 senses to get you started. And that's what we're going to have a go at doing now. So here's a picture of, it happens to be Auschwitz, but it could be anything. This is a picture of a building, fairly foreboding. You can get the impression there are people through the door in the background. So we're going to have a go at trying to describe what we can see in this picture. And we're going to focus not on telling a story, but on showing the reader what's in the picture. So if we use the senses as our starting point, that should hopefully help us to come up with some useful ideas to help us with our writing. So let's have a look at the picture to get us started. Okay, so we're ready to write. If we think about the senses, let's go for the most obvious to start with. Let's have a think about what we can see. So, useful bits that we could maybe focus on. The sky, I think in this picture, is particularly interesting. So, have a look at the clouds. The most obvious way would be to describe them as grey. Okay, that's fairly obvious. But that's really telling the reader rather than showing them. So let's try and expand that. Could we say that they're looming? Could we say that they are foreboding? There's a sense of something bad about to happen. A good word for clouds as well as looming, maybe we could use lowering, one of my favourites. Could we say something about the contrast between the clouds and the light? Because the light just here behind the building really stands out. So how could we phrase that? Could we say maybe that the light pierces the clouds? Perhaps we could also think about personification. Could we say that the clouds are glaring? It makes them look sound as if they're looking down. Could we have them as a metaphor? Let's go for something a little cliched. Could we have something like ships at sea? The clouds bobbed in the breeze. That's not great, but you get the idea. So now that we've got our clouds described, what might be the next thing that we could move on to have a think about? So let's try going for the building itself. What might it be useful to focus on? I like this bit here, just because it looks like a mouth to me with 2 little eyes. So could we compare it to something like hell? Remember that this is Auschwitz. So are we going to say that the door is a hell mouth? Could we say that maybe this tower in the middle is like a sort of a spear piercing the sky? We've already used piercing for the clouds, but obviously you would change that depending on the context. If we're carrying on that idea of the places being almost human, here the train tracks that go into the mouth, to me they're kind of almost like bones or ribs. So could we say that the track is rib-like? Makes it sound like a part of a body disappearing into the building, which again is quite pertinent if this is Auschwitz. Now obviously all of that is slightly more creative, but there's no reason why we can't just go for the more obvious things as well. So we can go for dark, we can go for harsh, we can go for rigid, all of those types of things as well. But remember, we want to try and vary as much as possible our vocabulary. So all of that's great for what we can see. Now we maybe need to think about one of the other senses. So should we look at sound? Imagining that you were in this place, what might it sound like? I suppose you've really got 2 options. We're either going to say that we can hear the sounds of the people are like a rushing wind. Again, a little cliched. Or we can say something about the silence. Now remember, if we're turning this into an image, a device, can we say that the silence is dense? Because obviously dense applies to things, a physical quality rather than a sound. Could we maybe hear the rustle of leaves? Could we hear the grass swaying in the wind? The reason for focusing on these things is that it builds that picture. It builds a more interesting and effective description of the whole thing. Another useful one to focus on is smell. A lot of people find this one slightly more tricky to focus on because obviously it's a little less obvious. But smell links to taste. So here, remembering that this is a concentration camp, can we smell the bitter smoke? Is the smell acrid? That then links into taste because it's something that you can feel in the back of your throat. Does it smell neglected, abandoned? Think as well about this one for the feeling of the path under your feet. Is it cold? Is it hard? Is it unloved? So that really is what forms the basis of your planning. When you're thinking about your stimulus, this could be a picture or it could be a topic. Try and think in terms of the senses and try and think about the devices and the vocabulary that you might want to use to describe. The next trick is to try and put that into sentences. So let's have a go at writing this into sentences and seeing if we can make it as descriptive as possible. So let's start with something fairly bland. Let's say the sight was cold and forbidding. Fine, nothing wrong with that as a sentence, but how could we improve it? You can improve it by starting with the adjectives. So, cold and forbidding, don't forget the comma, the sight was. Now the trick is, obviously in our first sentence, we didn't have a second clause, so we've got to finish that off. Cold and forbidding, the sight was awful to behold. Okay, that's not too bad. So let's go for the tower loomed ahead like a huge spear. Again, reasonable, but is there anything that we can do to improve it? So let's try putting a semicolon and then we can have a second half to the sentence. The tower loomed ahead like a huge spear. It pierced the clouds, letting the light shine through. Okay, we've got a few complex sentences there, so let's try a simple one for impact. Cold and forbidding, the sight was awful to behold. The tower loomed ahead like a huge spear. It pierced the clouds, letting the light shine through. Silence. One-word sentences are really useful because they break up the intensity of the writing. There's no reason as well why we couldn't put that as a separate paragraph if we wanted to. Let's try starting a sentence with a verb. We'll think about the clouds. So let's say billowing overhead. Billowing overhead the clouds. Don't forget, again, billowing looks like a verb, but we need a main verb for our main clause. And if we're writing in the past tense, that's got to be in the past. So, billowing over the heads, the clouds glared at me. Let's join that with a short sentence. Nothing moved. Okay, let's try and use the good image about the train track being like ribs. So let's say broken and disjointed. The ribs of the track cracked as they entered the hell mouth. Remember as well that we're trying to think about sound here. So the ribs of the track cracked. Good example of assonance there to get the feeling of the piece of writing. Now obviously you wouldn't just leave it there. You'd continue your piece of writing, you'd describe as many things as you possibly could. You can also include in there your personal feelings and emotions at whatever stimulus point it is. So for this picture, you might explain how upset you feel, how disappointed, whatever it might be. If it's a stimulus where you're writing about a particular place or a particular moment, obviously that's something that you would then have to work out for yourself. So, just to recap about what it is that is a useful starting point for you in your writing. So first of all, remember to think about DVDs. Once you've remembered what DVDs are, devices, vocabulary, design and senses, then put that together in your planning. Plan the words and the phrases that you think you might want to use in your writing, and then all it is a case of joining all of those together in a crafted piece of writing. Remember to use connectives. Remember to vary your sentence structure and starters.